Hi everyone, it's Andrea from Movers and Bakers. Today I'm going to share with you how I make my delicious Cherry Bakewell Tartlets. These are a mini take on a classic British bake, absolutely gorgeous and perfect little mouthfuls. Let's get baking. Okay, so to start with, we are going to make our pastry. If you've never made pastry before, it is not hard. Don't panic about it. There are just a few rules for you to follow. So I'm going to use a food processor today, but you can do it in a big bowl by hand if you want. I'm just doing it in a food processor for speed and for laziness, really. So into my food processor, I'm going to put some plain flour, and to that, I'm going to add some icing sugar. I'm going to give this a couple of little whiz arounds just to get the flour and the sugar completely mixed up. There we go, that's all I'm doing with that. And to that mix, I'm going to add my butter. Now here's one of the tips. When you use butter to make pastry, you have to make sure your butter is as cold as you can get it. So that's another reason why I'm choosing to do it in a machine rather than by hand, because my hands would be more likely to warm it up. So into my machine, I'm going to put all my butter. This is really cold. I chopped it up and popped it back in my fridge just to keep it really nice and cold. So we're going to pulse this a few times until it's more like breadcrumbs. And that's it done. So that was maybe 10 or 15 pulses. That's all that you want. And you want your mixture to look a little bit breadcrumby. You can see how it kind of falls and it's kind of half sticking together a little bit. That's the texture that you're looking for. So I'm going to pop that back on there. And to this, I'm going to add 2 egg yolks. Now you don't have to put egg yolks in, but I actually find that this makes the pastry really rich and really lovely. So I really like putting egg yolks in. So same again, I'm just going to blitz it round until it's mixed through. So that's taking about 5 or 6 pulses for all that to be mixed in. Don't worry if you see little bits that aren't quite mixed, it'll all come together in the end. My mixture is still quite bitty, it's not come together quite yet. So to help it, I'm going to put some water in. Now this is just plain water, but it is like the butter, it is really, really cold. You want to try and keep this mixture as cold as you can while you're making it, and it's going to chill out in the fridge. It's going to rest in the fridge as well before we use it. So a tablespoon at a time. I'm just going to pop it in and just give it pulse it a little and see how much I need to bring it all together. And that's what you're looking for. My mixture is looking good to go. So you want it to have started clumping together. That was probably about 2.5 tablespoons of water that I used there. Now I'm going to show you the texture. The next step, on a clean work surface, you're going to tip all of this out and just squeeze it together. So you don't actually want it to be really, you don't want it to be sticking together a lot by itself, because you don't want to overwork the dough. So now that we've got to the stage where all our ingredients are blended, you want to be really sure that you are not overworking your dough or you're going to get a really tough pastry. It's not going to be lovely and flaky. So you can see that it's all still falling apart a little, but it's all going to come together, don't worry. Bring it all together and I'm just going to squeeze it very, very gently into a ball of dough. And while I'm doing this, it's a great time for me to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to like this video if you like all the tips I'm sharing with you today. So once you've brought all your dough together, let's just gather up all those bits. We're just going to flatten it down. Now the mixture that I've made here, I actually tend to make, whenever I make pastry, I tend to double what I need, and I'll split it in half and freeze one portion, and then it means I've always got some pastry ready to go. If I ever want to bake something, I can just defrost it and then use it, boom. So for today, that's exactly what I'm going to do. What I've made here is a double portion, so I'm just going to split that in half, and then one half I'm going to roll a bit more into a ball and flatten it into a disc. That's just going to make it super easy to store. and that one's going to go in the freezer. Now, before I do anything else with my pastry, even for today's bake, this has to rest. So you want to make your dough into a disc, flatten it out, wrap them up in cling film, and you can pop them either in your fridge or your freezer. For the purposes of today, I'm going to let my dough chill out in my fridge for about half an hour, and then we will get going with the rest. Right, so my pastry has chilled for 30 minutes in the fridge, and now it's time to roll it out. So I have here a little bit of extra flour that I'm going to use in a moment to dust my work surface before I tip this out. And I've got a mini pastries case tin, you can see here, with a fluted cutter. Now you can use anything that you've got. I've got sets of fluted cutters and straight-sided cutters, but if you haven't got those, you can use a glass or a mug as well, just depending on the size of your individual pastry tins. So this much pastry, if you remember, I split my pastry in half. This much pastry, if you wanted to make one larger tart, that would make about an 8-inch pastry. That would be sufficient for about 8 inches. So on my work surface, I'm going to just put a bit of extra flour on, and we're going to roll it out. Now it will be tougher because the butter has obviously solidified a little bit, but the reason that we roll our pastry out, that we chill it, before we roll it, is to not only let the butter cool down again, but also to let the gluten relax, which means you're not going to have tough pastry that seizes up when it bakes. So I like to make my pastry fairly thin. That's probably about 2 or 3 millimeters thick. If you want to make it a bit thicker, you can do, but obviously the thicker the pastry, the less filling you get in it. So I'm making it thinner so we get more filling. Right, so once you've rolled out, it's time to get stamping. So I like to stamp all of them out at the same time, but you can do it whatever way makes you happy. Once you have stamped out your pastry, just use a palette knife or a little knife just to loosen it at the bottom and lift it up. And then when I put it in my case, I actually put it over the top, and I find something that fits, as it happens my rolling pin does. It fits perfectly into the size of each of these holes. So I'm going to use that just to help me guide it in straight. As you can see, I twist it a little. Now everyone has their own technique. This is just one I've done, and I guide the ends so that it goes in, and trying to not let it crease or anything, as you can see, as I push it in. And that's how I get my pastry to be perfectly fitting in. So I'm going to do that with all of this, and then we will get on with the filling. And that's the last of my pastry cases in, so that is good to go. I'm going to pop that in the fridge while I quickly make the filling to go in. Right, so while my pastry is chilling in the fridge, I'm quickly going to put my frangipane together. This is really easy. I've got some butter here. This is unsalted butter. And before I add any of my other ingredients, I'm just going to give it a very quick mix together, just to make sure it's nice and soft and everything mixes together really easily. Lovely, perfect. And to that, I'm going to add some caster sugar and some ground almonds, 1 egg, and for just a little bit of extra almond flavour, 1/2 teaspoon of almond extract. We're going to give this a quick mix together. And that is the frangipane all done. All I'm going to do is transfer that into a piping bag. Okay, so to my pastry now, it's time to assemble. To my pastry, in the bottom of each, I've got some cherry jam here, some black cherry conserve, in fact. And I'm just going to put a little bit in the bottom of each of my pastry shells and make sure it covers the whole of the bottom of your pastry. So do it really gently so that you don't scrape your pastry and put holes in it, because obviously then it's going to go through. So you want to try and spread it around the bottom of your pastry. Make sure it doesn't come up the sides. And the reason for that is, if you have it coming up the sides, if it comes up the sides at all, once you've got the frangipane and it goes in the oven, it's going to bubble up the sides and it's going to make for a bit of a messy pastry with all the jam coming up, and it'll go everywhere. So you want to try really hard to keep the jam as a nice lovely layer, but right on the very bottom of the pastry case and not coming up the sides at all. So I'm going to fill all of these with my cherry jam, just spreading it out into as flat a layer as I can get. Okay, and once you have got all your jam in, it's time to pop our frangipane in. Now, I've popped it in a piping bag because I find it makes it much neater and much easier to get it in. If you wanted to just use a teaspoon and spoon it in that way, of course, that's absolutely fine too. So, I'm going to put just a blob in. Now, you don't want to fill your frangipane all the way to the top because it will rise a little bit as it bakes. So having it come slightly under the edge of your pastry is perfect. It'll rise and that'll give us enough room to then put our glaze on top once they are cooled. So I'm going to fill all these up, and then this is going to go in my oven. It's going to bake for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I will see you on the other side for the finishing touches. All right, so my tartlets came out of the oven. I let them cool in the tin for a few minutes before moving them onto my cooling rack, and I've left them to cool completely before we do the next step. So in my bowl here, it's just some icing sugar and milk. So you can make as much as you want depending on how much icing you want to use, but I will put the quantities for this and all my ingredients in the link below on my blog that you can find if you want to make this yourself. So I've made this, as you can see, fairly thick because I wanted to make a lovely thick layer of glaze over the top of each of my tartlets. So I'm going to grab a spoonful and we're just going to tip it onto the top. And then very, very gently, I'm just going to spread it all the way to the edges. And of course, it wouldn't be Bakewell if we didn't have a cherry on top. So these are glacé cherries. I've cut them in half, and I'm just going to pop one right on top of that beautiful glaze we have just put on our tartlets. And there you have it. I'm just going to do that with all of those, but that's my first one done. Mini Bakewell tartlets. Thanks so much for joining me today. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button if you have, and I shall see you next time. Happy baking.